Welcome, Alison. Good to see you again. We're ready to roll when you are.
Kia ora koutou. Happy new financial year. Cause for celebration. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. We've all been wearing party hats and blowing our little whistles down in finance. It's okay. Ratepayers have not contributed towards these. These have come out of my pocket. They might argue that they pay me, but I've chosen to spend my money on the team. Right, so let's kick off. Councillor Fox has noticed that, yes, we do indeed have pens, so we have some more of that individual and collective activity work today, but you'll be pleased to know that it is the last hands-on workshop we're doing in this series. You then have to wait until August to get your next dose. Right. So the aptly named Right Tool for the Right Job workshop today. So we're going to explore how the key financial policies support that strategic direction and help project future choices while balancing today's needs. So that's the journey we've been on the whole way through. So today's workshop builds on those foundations that you established through workshops 1 and 2. So workshop 1 explored what matters, so that was the community outcomes and strategic priorities. And workshop 2 explored what sustains that. Workshop 3 is about focusing on the tools that are available to help us achieve those outcomes. So what do we have not only to achieve them, but more importantly, how do we avoid asking one policy to solve every problem that we care about or every issue that we need to address? Because that's when we can unintentionally reduce that flexibility that we so desperately need in local government. So we're going to understand at a very high level the key financial policies that sit within the Local Government Act. You're not going to walk out of here today as experts in those policies by any stretch of the imagination, so that's not the piece we're doing here. There will be further detailed policy discussions that happen in August. But we are going to look at why different policies exist for different purposes. We're going to recognise the connection between those foundational workshops and the policy design itself, and we're going to agree, and it's through an activity, so it will be a feedback that I'll need to provide post-workshop, on a draft set of future fit policy design principles, something that we can hold up each time we're going through a policy review and go, how does it fit within these principles? So the question we're asking, well, this is probably the question I'm asking, because I'm assuming that we're all on the same journey in terms of community outcomes, strategic priorities are the things we want to achieve, and that we want our policies to align in such a way that we can achieve those things. This one's really for me in terms of how do we therefore develop the policies in a way that means that we're preserving that adaptability as well. So I take the first things as given. It's going to give you your outcomes eventually somewhere. But this is also about making sure that we still remain future fit and we can be agile. So we're going to split it into about 30% of today is going to be in the no space, so that's that key financial policies and the role that they play. About a further 20% in terms of that alignment with workshop 1 and 2, and that will simply be through the activity pieces that you're doing. And about half of today is going to be in that activity hands-on stuff that I've found so valuable from the discussions that you have had and what you have put down on paper that has really helped start galvanising for me what the financial strategy might look like. So you're going to provide those directions around the principles that we should be designing our policies around. So workshops 1 and 2 recap. You'll recall in workshop 1 that you shared what matters in terms of the community outcomes, strategic priorities, growth, affordability, resilience, future opportunities, and you delved into some of those trade-offs. And we started to see where perhaps there was a little bit of where things don't align, what challenges we might need to address through the long-term plan, and where are the areas that we'll need to work on collectively to have a collective view. So then in workshop 2, we talked about what sustains those community outcomes and strategic priorities by covering the financial concepts that sit underneath long-term decision making. So we talked about the key concepts of balanced budgets, funding depreciation, debt and borrowing capacity, the interest costs, intergenerational equity, financial sustainability, and preserving future options through flexible policies. And the concepts are designed to help us understand or ask who pays, what are we paying for, when do we pay, and why do we choose one approach over another. I did send out some pre-reading. Well, it was under the guise of pre-reading, but it was really about trying to dig into that depreciation funding for infrastructure. We're not going to cover that in today's workshop, but if there's anything in that paper that you want to discuss, let me know and we can set aside some time to dig into that. And then we talked about what settings aid or hinder flexibility, and that room to move flexibility continuum is largely based around debt headroom, interest costs as a percentage of your rates revenue. So that's the stuff where if we manage that very tightly, it gives you more flexibility to absorb shocks and have ability to make future choices. We also talked about where our constraints sit, both specifically for HDC, so that limited borrowing headroom, 26-27, we're talking about $5 million in terms of your own debt caps, in terms of headroom, rising interest costs, so at the moment as a proportion of rates, we're sitting at about 12%, and that's increasing. There's ongoing affordability pressures, historic sector underfunding pressures, increased infrastructure expectations, that growth versus resilience investment, and then having highly targeted and flexible funding settings, which you'll know local government or the government are working on settings for local government in terms of how might they be able to help expand the toolbox or change up some of the tools we have within the box, like development levies, to give us some more flexibility moving forward. So in terms of the activities that you undertook, so you'll remember we have the continuums and you all had to place yourselves on those. So growth and investment, varied views regarding the pace and timing of that, but you mainly, on the whole, sat between that immediate investment and the fully demand-led delivery. And there was little support for those extreme ends of the scale. In terms of funding fairness, this is where the challenge is really going to lie. There wasn't a clear consensus in this space, so this is where it tells me already our revenue and financing policy is going to be a piece of work that we'll have to work on in a different way than perhaps some of our other policy settings, because this is an area that needs some attention. In terms of affordability and sustainability, following on from the last one, there's that recognition around the trade-offs between affordability today and affordability tomorrow, but you're not aligned in terms of that balance, so another thing to address. And what we heard in terms of, you'll remember at the end we had the things that helped build flexibility, that sort of depends whether it helped build or reduce, and then the reduces flexibility. So these, you were broadly aligned in these spaces. So the most commonly identified ones were that broad rating base, funding depreciation, balanced operating position, large borrowing headroom, and staged capital delivery. This is absolute gold as we work through your financial strategy, etc. So these are the things that we're aiming for. In terms of the concepts most commonly identified as depending, or it depends on context, is that strong user pays, multiple targeted rates, fixed funding splits, prioritised investment, and flexible policy settings. So these are the areas, these are the challenges that we need to work through, and it's similar to that whole revenue financing policy. And then in terms of reducing flexibility, this was the one that you were absolutely unanimous on, was the high debt, having debt that was too high. So these are the things that we need to manage, and it might not be that we can manage them straight away, but we need to have a plan to manage them, and it needs to be very clear in our strategy in terms of what we're doing in that space. So we're almost at the first activity. So the toolbox today, this activity that we're about to talk about, is in relation to the financial strategy and policy toolbox, but then I'm going to touch a little bit more on the wider Local Government Act toolbox after we finish the activity. Now, noting that some elected members are new around the table, I'm not expecting you to be policy experts. This slide here I'm going to leave up on the screen. Hopefully it helps as we work through this exercise. You are going to do it as individuals, and then have a discussion as a group, and then feed back into the group as per what we've been doing in the last 2 workshops. And it's really about working through some scenarios. Now I need 4 groups of 3, so I'm going to ask somebody from over here to come and join this table over here to make a 3, because we've only got 2 at this front table. But I'll give you some pens and a piece of paper, and then instructions. Right. Whakarongo mai, so listening here, ears on please. Right, so you've got 5 minutes of individual reflection, and you can use your pen. So you've got 5 scenarios, and based on these things around the circle, I would like you to try and identify which policy you think fits with which scenario in terms of solving it. There may be multiple, and so my suggestion would be to put a tick or something against those that are listed beneath the scenario as to what might apply in terms of solving that particular issue. Are we clear? Councillor Jennings, you're looking at me like You're clear? Okay, cool. And then you'll have a discussion as a group for the next 5 minutes, and then one of you will feed back into the room. All right, your time starts now. And it's not a test. Nobody's going to fail. Quick check-in. If I give you 5 minutes more, you think you'll be in a position where you would have had a discussion as a group and be able to present back? Oh, wow, okay. 8 minutes. Okay, all right. How about I give you one more minute? Let's go to 2 o'clock and then we'll feed back into the room. All right. All done? Shall we start with this table over here? So just give us your thoughts.
We're scenario 1, revenue and finance and development contributions. And if we had to rank them, we'd go revenue and finances, the overarching, and development contributions is number 2, but those would be our 2. Do we go through the whole lot, Alison?
Yes, please.
Scenario 2, growth requires additional trunk, infrastructure, financial strategy and treasury management. And for scenario 3, the household experiencing genuine financial hardship, rates, remissions, and revenue and finance. Revenue and finance sort of drives, it's the overarching thing out of which falls the rates remission policy. Scenario 4, council wants to improve district-wide resilience. We're doing financial strategy for that one. And for scenario 5, wishing to reduce long-term debt, we're going treasury management and financial strategy in that order.
Thank you very much.
Scenario 1, if you're saying what's council's role in this space, then it's the financial strategy. But if there's an agreement that you are playing a role in that space, then it's probably the development contributions policy. Scenario 2, development contributions. Scenario 3 was the rates remissions / postponement policy. Scenario 4, financial strategy, and scenario 5, financial strategy.
Thank you very much. Next table, Kim.
Alrighty, we went with going with the instinct strategy. And in scenario 1, a significant increase in social housing is desired. We went with development contributions. In scenario 2, growth requires additional trunk infrastructure. We went with development contributions, followed closely by treasury management. Scenario 3, a household is experiencing genuine financial hardship. We went with rates remission, followed by revenue and financing. In scenario 4, council wants to improve district-wide resilience. We thought the most important one was financial strategy, followed by treasury management. And in scenario 5, council wishing to reduce long-term debt. We went with the financial strategy and treasury management.
Great, thank you very much. And last but not least,
Well, we had very in-depth discussions for a short period of time and came up with many options. So scenario 1, when we looked at a significant increase in social housing, we looked at a wider lens and a long-term lens rather than a short-term scenario. So we went with financial strategy in terms of long-term sustainability. We also went through revenue and finance policy, going from the last compassionate housing example that we had. We also went through development contributions, because if someone else is building it for us, do we ask for those development contributions, again from the example we had recently. And then we also had rates remissions, because that comes into play when it comes into social housing. Number 2, growth requires additional trunk infrastructure. We weren't quite sure what that additional infrastructure would be. It was quite broad. So again, we went with sustainability, so financial strategy, revenue and finance. Who pays for this? Is it NZTA? Is it us? Who is it? Where is it? Then we went through treasury management as well. Number 3, the household. We went from a larger lens of not just one household, but in terms of our current situation with cost of living crisis. This could be something that we were discussing the other day, could be a wider situation for us. So we went through financial strategy, revenue and financing, because who pays and why comes into it, depending on if we've got 300 people that come and say we can't afford our rates, sorry about that. That will feed into treasury management and obviously rates remissions. 4, resilience, financial strategy, revenue financing and treasury management. Again, depending on what are we talking about here? Is it community hubs? Are you talking about risk management, which will sit in another basket? And then scenario 5, financial strategy, revenue financing, development contributions and treasury management, because depending on the debt that we want to reduce, that hits the areas that we could possibly dip into.
fantastic. Thank you all so much. I'm now going to admit to being a little bit naughty. So, scenario number 1 was put there as a bit of a red herring. So, and it's actually based on something I've observed to date, and it's around social housing and how we manage that, and in particular in relation to the DC policy. So I was interested to see how many would put down the DC policy, and if I take a step back, I wonder whether some of that is because of the way our existing policy is framed. Development contributions is probably not the best way to deal with the social housing matter. You could have grants, partnerships, targeted programs, and budgets. It's less of a policy thing. But there is some discussion around strategy, absolutely. In terms of the growth infrastructure, development contributions policy, yep. Hardship, rates remissions, you've all got there. Resilience, multiple tools. So that could be, it depends, I think somebody talked about the context, it depends what resilience we're talking about. Are we talking about resilience to natural disaster? Are we talking about asset resilience? Are we talking about financial resilience? All those things means, and so that was another red herring, sorry about that. And then the debt reduction, I did hear a lot of you talk about the Treasury and the financial strategy. You're bang on in that space. Those are absolutely the two areas that you would use in terms of dealing with that. So that was an activity before we've actually been through the policy settings and what they're for and why you use a certain policy in a certain way. And this is taking an analogy to its nth degree, and it would never happen. But I don't know how many of you have a dishwasher and does a great job of washing the dishes, but the drying cycle isn't as effective as like a tea towel. So plastics, those reusable plastics, they never come out dry. But this is taking it to the nth degree of that, right? You're not going to use your dishwasher to vacuum your carpet or mow the lawn or hang out the washing. And it's sort of, when you use a policy or a strategy and you're using it for the wrong purpose, you get poor outcomes, which can be frustrating. It's ineffective, inefficient, waste time, resources. It can simply just be awkward and impractical and doesn't get the job done. There's kind of an exception to this rule, and it's almost the Swiss Army knife, right? That thing can do all sorts of things. It's not just for cutting and getting into things, as I discovered. There's actually some tweezers, all sorts of stuff. But this is the analogy for the Local Government Act. So this is the toolbox. So the Swiss Army knife is the toolbox. The little individual implements are each of the policies or the strategies, and they've all got specific purposes. And so it's not about making one policy to do everything. It's actually about selecting the right tool from the toolbox to get the job done. And policies do become less effective when they're trying to scattergun solve every problem. So the Local Government Act has a number of tools in the box, and they're all designed to do specific things. And we do see some of them can be used for, like the dishwasher, can be used to wash the dishes and dry the dishes. But normally that's secondary purpose. You've got to accept that it's not going to be the best tool. But it might be in the absence of having a broader toolbox, which is what the government are working on and providing. So now we're going to work through each of the tools at a really high level before we finish up with the last activity. So this one's it's broader than this diagram. I'm actually going to take you through the Local Government Act toolkit. So there's some things that are in there. There are other tools available to local government that sit outside the Local Government Act, but we're not going to talk about those today. So the financial strategy, what I'm going to take you through is what it does, what it's designed to do, what it's not designed to do, and why it sits in the Local Government Act. So this is required under the Local Government Act because council must demonstrate how it intends to remain financially sustainable over the long term. So its primary purpose is to establish the financial guardrails within which future decisions are made. So it's effectively that operating system that sits underneath everything else. So it helps answer how much debt is acceptable, what rates increases are sustainable, and how much risk can council carry, and how much flexibility should be preserved. So it does require you to think about intergenerational issues. It's not designed to prioritise individual projects or set detailed budgets or service levels. The infrastructure strategy, it also sits under the key financial policy section actually of the Local Government Act. This one's about council demonstrating how infrastructure services will be sustained over at least 30 years. Many councils do 50 years, but it has to be at least 30 years. And the primary purpose is to understand future infrastructure needs and investment requirements. So it really is about the stuff that people have on the ground, not the services necessarily themselves, but the hard infrastructure. And it does talk about what level of service and resilience future communities should expect. And it's where that engineering reality and financial reality start to have that conversation together. So you do have an option under the Local Government Act to combine your financial strategy and your infrastructure strategy. That can be challenging because the time frames, you might be able to plan your infrastructure out for 30 years in the future based on the growth, the financial aspects, and having that 10-year view rather than a 30-year view is much more, well, cycles happen, and it's pretty hard to stick to your financial strategy as though it's written in pen. So it helps to answer what assets we own, when will they require renewal, what's the future demand that exists, and therefore what needs to be put in, and what risks are emerging that could impact on our infrastructure. So climate change is actually a big piece, or climate adaptability is a big piece in an infrastructure strategy. It's not designed to determine the funding sources, or to set rates, or to make affordability decisions. The significance and engagement policy, this isn't a financial policy, but it's one of the other settings in the Local Government Act in terms of the toolbox. So this is about you determining when your community should be involved in decisions, and to define what decisions matter enough to require additional engagement. So this is a conversation about trust. You get elected as councillors. What are those decisions that you feel your communities put the trust in you as their elected member to make versus actually, hey, this thing we need to get some more feedback on? And we've had a great example of that recently with the amalgamation conversations for Head Start. So it helps answer what is significant, so it actually defines that for council. When should communities be consulted? How should decisions be communicated? But it's not designed to determine the decision, and it's not designed to replace the governance judgment around this table. So it's just a tool. The favourite one, this is actually the heart of local government politics, this one, and I think this is where all the tensions and the energy needs to be. So it's required under the Local Government Act because council must explain how activities will be funded and why, and it determines who pays for council's activities and why. And there is actually a two-step process to this, and it's actually something that the government is not proposing to take out of the Local Government Act. So at the moment there's a whole heap of criteria in terms of exacerbator, benefits, user, all of these categorisations in terms of how you work through the who should pay. And then as a second stage, there is the wellbeing layer in terms of, is there anything you would look at differently when you put a social, cultural, or environment lens over the top. And so the biggest challenge is determining that fair funding split. And I think we've seen through the earlier workshops that is where the tension sits. So it helps answer who benefits, who causes the need, who should contribute, and whether there's a wider public benefit. It's not designed to solve the affordability issues, and it's not about driving growth outcomes or replacing your budget decisions. So it's still a who pays for what and why, not the how we get to the affordability piece.
Alison, can I just ask a question about how you talked about that second step of putting the wellbeing lens over it? How does that reconcile with the current systems improvement bill, which removes the wellbeings as a I'll get the language correctly here, but the gist is that essentially the wellbeings are no longer a job for the council.
I don't know that that's what the changes are really about. It's saying that that's not the purpose of local government, but and even this is a consideration. So the whole process, so these are settings that get determined by you as elected members. And so that whole understanding and doing almost like the analysis piece to get here's the purest view. If we were going to do nothing else but apply who benefits, who caused that thing, and therefore who should contribute, that gives you if you're going to be totally user pays, that's the direction that you want to set. It then requires you to look at that and put that more holistic view, so the intergenerational equity view, those well-beings, for consideration. So all of this is subjective. It is about how you feel around this table on those matters. But it does require us to actually document it and actually work through that discussion and have it, this is how our council arrived at this decision around who pays for what. That answer?
Can I just say as well, it's not that the well-beings have been taken out. They're there, but they're not at the forefront. The well-beings are actually addressed through the different policies that we have. For example, they might be addressed through the community well-being, they might be addressed through something else, but they're just not at the forefront. It's not that we don't look at them anymore, it's just that they're being put in a different ranking order, and they're still there. And also in terms of impacts, that's one thing that I quite like using that word, because the impact of the decisions that we make kind of flows through some of the who benefits, who causes the need, who should contribute. Is that something that I think that's a really good word to say, what impact will this have if we do this?
And that's probably the piece that gets you into your consideration of the wider public benefit. So when you go through the very regimented, this is who's benefiting, who's causing it, etc., it's then that if we apply our funding around who pays for what based on that, what impact might that have for the wider public, and what do we therefore want to address in how we set our funding policies. Okay. The other one that's key, especially given you've got that strategic priority, or this council has a strategic priority around going for growth, is the development contributions policy. So under legislation, council may recover growth-related infrastructure costs from development. It's not a council has to, it's council may. And the primary purpose is to ensure that growth contributes towards growth-related costs. And the legislation in this area is extensive. And there's been a number of changes since probably 2005 2004, I think it was first introduced, but there's been a number of flip-flopping with various governments around whether particular community things such as playgrounds, etc., should be part of a development contribution policy. There's been things taken out, added back in. It's complex. It's complex for the government. It is absolutely a tool that they are revising at the moment, and so noting that development levies and a new regime is coming down the line. This is really, we're talking about the policies that exist at the moment in the toolkit, so we would need to do some revision as we go through the long-term plan. I think they're looking at having this released in the post-election period, or maybe just before the development levies. End of this calendar year, I think. It's on the table for. So this policy helps answer what infrastructure is growth creating demand for. What proportion should growth fund, and what proportion of that infrastructure actually benefits existing communities. This is an extremely litigious area. Many councils have been taken to task over their development contributions policy and the fairness around developers paying for portions of infrastructure. So it's something that needs a lot of care and energy. But basically it's about making sure that growth pays for growth. It's not designed to solve housing affordability. It's not designed to fund historical underinvestment. So if you've got a level of service and you're not currently complying with that, so you haven't, so say within a kilometre of every resident there's a reserve or something like that, if you're not complying with that, you can't say that a portion of that is related to growth. You have to meet that level of service for the existing community first. That's not to say that as you go through a development and a subdivision plan and stuff that you don't want them to create these spaces or whatever, but in terms of the policy that you provide for developers in terms of their individual payments, you need to make sure you're on top of the level of service before you start charging for growth. So that is actually an underpinning principle. And the other thing it's not designed to do, and this is the area that we have in play at the moment for our development contributions policy, is it's not designed to subsidise unrelated community outcomes. So it's not like the revenue and financing policy, who should pay for what and why. This one is a growth pays for growth, very, very legally set out in terms of what can be charged for, etc. At the moment, we have a remissions policy that's sitting in the middle of our DC policy. And since 2021, through the hearings process, I think there's been approximately 700,000 of remitted development contribution levies. That is a process that falls to ratepayers, maybe not in the immediate term, but over time. So by taking the remission out of the policy itself, you can then set some boundaries around grants, you can put budget aside, you can still get the same outcomes that you're seeking, but it becomes a transparent decision that your communities are very clear that this portion, for example, is being picked up by ratepayers because of the social aspect, where at the moment that remissions policy sitting in the middle of it means that you're using that tool for a different purpose than what it's designed for. So when you get a 50-lot subdivision and it's going to be social housing, those 50 houses are still placing extra demand on your networks, and you may be required to invest additional money in infrastructure. So by putting the social part in it, you're mixing your drinks. So it's about making sure that you keep the right tool for the right thing, which is where earlier that social housing thing was thrown in there for this purpose. Because there are changes coming in the development levy space, it may be that through the long-term plan we determine to not look at this actually until that's landed, but it's just something to have in the back of your mind for future policy design. From a liability management treasury policy piece, so there's an investment policy and a liability policy that you can combine those together. These are decisions that the elected members get to make without consulting with your community, but it's about making sure that councils have in place processes and policy to manage borrowing and financial risks prudently. So you have to be a prudent financial steward as a local council, and this is the thing. These are the two policies that help evidence that. So the primary purpose is to manage debt, liquidity and financial risk. And so that piece around what are we preserving our borrowing capacity for is something that over the coming years we want to probably have at the forefront of our treasury risk management policy. What is it that we're trying to achieve here?
Sorry, Alison, just a quick query. Where does depreciation fit in all this? Which policy are you talking about? Is this under this policy or is it revenue and financing?
It's actually under your financial strategy. Yeah, combined with your budgeting decisions. So this one is about how much debt is acceptable. So it does have, so it kind of picks up your financial strategy direction and puts it into an implementation type policy. So it's got your debt caps in there. It talks about how much liquidity needs to be maintained in order to meet your obligations and how much interest rate risk that you can carry as a council. Again, it doesn't determine service levels or do any prioritisation of projects or make investment decisions. It's just about that financial sustainability. How do I take the financial strategy and implement that from a pure treasury management perspective rather than your budgeting perspective? Rates, remission and postponement policies. This is another area that, and my observation would be, we've got a lot of these. So we have 17 rates remission policies, which adds a lot of complexity. I spent some time this morning with Lynette from rates, and some of the mechanisms we've put in place are quite administratively onerous. So I'd really like to see this one flex in the LTP if we can.
Sorry, can I just ask, of those 17, is that normal and usual, or is that something that we've created within council over the years?
I would have to say I'm not an expert across everybody's policy settings. It's certainly higher than what I have seen at the council that I worked at before here. But I think part of it is the underlying rating mechanisms and then trying to fix some of the outliers through putting in a policy. But yeah, we can talk in more detail as we develop the long-term plan. So this one here is about, so Local Government Act allows councils to choose to provide relief in specified circumstances. So it's about recognising exceptional circumstances and providing targeted relief where appropriate. And so the governance discussion really needs to be around where should that line sit between individual circumstances and community responsibility. Because when you put remissions in, somebody else is picking up the portion that you're remitting. So that's how remissions work. And they are usually at their best when they're limited. So when they do actually become exceptions rather than the rule, and that's where the 17 bothers me. It feels like it's remissions have become this rule. We're having to set up a new thing to address something each time.
Oh no, and then we discovered that there was one that had been established that nobody's ever used. That was the postponement. So, yeah.
There is a place for postponement. There's a lot of things that have to go under the bridge before you can really genuinely say that's the best route for an individual ratepayer to take. It normally means they don't have any family support, they couldn't sustain actually, being a tenant in a property, etc. And they've just got the asset and very income poor, and it wouldn't be somebody who's, I don't know, in the middle of their life or younger. It's probably for those people where, for compassionate reasons, you help them through a process that actually means that once that home changes ownership in future years, that the rates are recovered then. It does have costs associated with it. So it's complex, but it's really that last backstop if it ever got to that. So,
The other thing that seems to change, that will change the context, is the ratepayer assistance scheme stuff. Mike might throw something at me, but that's still progressing, right? And so it actually probably removes the need for councils to have these standalone policies or mechanisms, and the only one that really is really problematic for us and needs the focused discussion is around the upzoning of properties, because that's a reality that we face in the growth context, where you might have a rural property at the moment and then their property is rezoned to residential, and so unless they're realising the gains from that change in zoning, they actually are in a economically worse off position because they're paying a higher rate, but they're not necessarily developing the property. So
not necessarily. So one of the things with your land value based methodology is for your general rates, and this is I'm a little bit confused about this, so I'd love for you to enlighten me. But when you have your revaluation process every 3 years, land is valued on the highest and best use. So even if council zoning doesn't say that this block of rural land is best suited for subdivision and growth, that is the base of which the valuation process works in terms of highest and best use. So
then what explains our peaks that we've been seeing with the current remission then? Because that's the remission that is oversubscribed, is where there's been an upzoning. So something's broken then somewhere in there.
Or it could simply be that we have people that are very good at understanding what tools are available to them to limit their exposure. So it's interesting to me that council has a land value based general rate and then has a differential based on the fact that actually, we're not quite happy with that as a pure solution because it does this to rural land. So there's a bit of, I need to unpick how we got to where we are so that I understand the views of this table, and some of the views may carry forward from political terms, and it may be that there's also similar views from new councillors, but I'd really just like to understand so that we can make sure that the things that you want to protect are kept in revenue and financing policies and rating mechanisms. So, not a question to answer today.
No, sorry, no. Look, it has been a thing that I have had more visits over than anything else from disgruntled ratepayers about the valuation that QV have put on that best use, and they're the ones that are having to suddenly, especially when we've had that high increase of rates, where a lot of people weren't happy, and that's why it was oversubscribed.
And so one of the things that you see, and you'll know that the majority of councils in New Zealand use capital value rather than land value for their general rate. And part of that is that largely in the provincial type areas, which we are a provincial council, so they've got that mix of urban and rural. And it's because when you use capital value, those rural properties aren't having to pay for the built form that exists in an urban area, because the capital value stuff sort of helps even that out. So they start paying more on the basis of how many, properties they've decided to put on their own farm, or like it's less of a shock, but it's a big shock when you move initially from land value to capital value. And I've seen a number of councils where they use remission policies over several years to actually do that realignment so that it's not such a big financial shock. But we're kind of doubling down on it because we go, let's do land value as the basis, but then we recognise that perhaps penalises the rural community, so we've got that 50% differential. And then we say, and every urban property that's connected to something needs to pay a fixed charge, or largely pay fixed charges for the services they receive. And so you end up having this high portion of fixed charges on an urban property. And we need to do some modelling to actually go, and you will have done it with your last rates review, and I understand you were quite close. It was pretty centre left, centre right, and you're determined to stick with what you've got, which is fine if that's the consensus around the table. I'm not arguing the view of the elected members. It's just about determining what's the best way to do things. Do we want to have 17 remissions, or do we want to design the rating system in such a way that you don't need to do that? Or vice versa, we might say actually we want to have a really simple rating system, but we want remissions to deal with the unintended impacts or something. So we've still got to work through this. This is going to be, as I said, a big discussion. So these policies, they don't constitute, they help answer what constitutes hardship. So we put in a whole heap of criteria that says this is what hardship actually is. They help answer what public benefits justify support. So if you want to, for example, that going for growth, so at the moment you've got a policy that sits around subdivision, the not quite fitting the mix there is that we also have caps that apply. So if you've got a rates remission policy, in theory that should be, because you've said this is okay for everybody that's in this circumstance, we're happy to remit this to this value because of this reason. But by setting caps across it, you're saying, but only if you're first in, first served. So there's a bit of things to work out there as well. And then how should relief be provided? So it may be, so for example, if you've got an excellent payment history and you haven't been late with any of your rates payments and you get a penalty applied, and you ring up council and we say, well, actually, you've got an excellent payment history, and so we're just going to remit those penalties, and you can determine that staff do that. And that's the general type of remission policies you see by and large. It may be, if they're not an excellent payment history ratepayer, that actually say, well, the penalties are going to continue to apply for the year, but if you put in place a payment arrangement with council so that it's a direct debit that we know you're going to honour through the year, and if we get to the end of the year and you've honoured all of those arrangements, then we'll remit the penalties. So there's things, those are the more common types of remissions that you have in place, sort of that short-term financial shock for someone, rather than messing around with the rating mechanisms themselves. So, as it says, it's not designed to replace that rates strategy. So you need to be very clear, what is the outcome that you're seeking from your rates mechanisms? What's the best way to achieve that? Understand at the time that you're setting your rates, what are those possible impacts? And therefore, do we want to have a short-term remission? And outline what that is. And they're not designed to solve broad affordability issues. So there are mechanisms that it's one of those unfortunate things where councils You know, we've got a lot of security over the properties in our district, which means that in a taxation system we have some powers, and it means that people might need to make some uncomfortable choices around whether they can actually afford to maintain the property that they live in if they feel that they can't meet the rates. As you'll know, like real estate agents who talk to their incoming, when they're going through a sale arrangement, the ones that talk about this is what the rates are, you need to pay the rates, it's one of those bills that you can't ignore, that's real estate gold for me, because people often think about servicing the mortgage, don't think about all of the other costs in terms of the services that are provided to that household. And it's not designed to become an alternative funding model. So if you find that you're doing more exceptions to the rule, then your funding model's the thing that needs to be looked at. So just in summary, so your LGA toolbox, and as I said, there are other tools in the box, but not in the Local Government Act themselves. They sit in other associated legislation. So the financial strategy, how sustainable do we want to be? You know, are we short-term focused or are we really long-term focused? Infrastructure strategy, what infrastructure will we need to support that rural-urban mix that we know about it from our financial strategy? Significance and engagement, when should we involve the community versus we know that the community trust us to make this decision? Revenue and financing, who pays and why? And development contributions, what should growth pay for? Treasury management policy, or that liability investment policy, how much risk is acceptable? So largely what you're doing on that policy is you're setting in place interest rate risk management. That means that when interest rates go higher or lower, you're actually keeping a pretty stable trajectory for your ratepayers, gives them a bit more certainty. And rates remissions, when should those exceptions apply? So we've got activity number 2. Yay! Yeah. We'll talk about this later, but after these workshops, I need a little bit of time to delve into what comes out of today, but I have been pulling together a pack, sort of like a 101 finance pack that sort of covers the speaking notes that we've had alongside the slides, so that you've got it for easy reference from your portal.
And we'll get that, won't we? Will we be able to?
You'll get the slides, so the slide pack goes in anyway, but it hasn't got the notes attached to it. So I'm pulling together a further piece of work that actually just helps outline some of those matters so that you can refer back to them. And when you try to go off on this tangent during the long-term plan, I can pull you back and go, no, you said these principles. That one's way over here. So this is why you're doing all the work. Okay, so workshop activity 2. I found the continuum piece that you all took part in incredibly useful for thinking about financial strategy and how that might shape up. So we're going to do another continuum activity, and this is around the future fit policy principles. So we're not going to be able to agree these today, but I will see from a piece of paper and from the discussion we have at the end where you're sitting in that space, so that I can pull together, here are the criteria we're going to use when we go through our policy revisions, which we might not do all of them for the LGP, but when we come to the next cab off the rank, we'll have that available to us. Sorry? I'm going to do it the same way that we just did before. So your pen, you're going to put yourself on a continuum, then you're going to discuss why you landed there, and then you can feed back to the group. So remember, you've got the line for each thing. Here's one extreme, here's the other extreme. Place yourselves on that continuum as individuals and then have a group discussion. So I want to see different marks all over every line. How are we doing? Are we done? We're done, and we're done with our discussion, and you can nominate a speaker. Perfect. Okay. All right, we'll kick off at the back then.
So preserve future flexibility. We were all pretty to the essential side. I was actually the more moderate one there for a change. Growth should contribute appropriately. We're all strongly to the left, which means that that's probably more of a user pays approach. Use the right tool for the right purpose. What growth should contribute appropriately? That means that you'd be expecting people to pay for it. Use the right tool for the right purpose. Where to the left again, strongly agree. Maintain adaptability through change, leading more towards the left. Consider intergenerational fairness. We're sort of in the centre with that, and avoid unnecessary complexity. And this was quite interesting. Joe was to the left. I was to the leftish. Strongly agree, and Sam was in the middle.
Thank you. We'll go over here.
Read some of the questions a little bit differently. Preserve future flexibility. Two of us were closer to the essential, and one useful but not critical. Growth should contribute appropriately. I underline what do you mean appropriately, but strongly leaning towards strongly agree. Use the right tool, for the right purpose. Strongly agree. Maintain adaptability through change. Two closer to the middle, one essential. And consider intergenerational fairness. Again, I question the word fairness. Two closer to essential, one in the middle. And avoid unnecessary complexity. Strongly agree.
Thank you. Over to Mayor Bernie's table. Thank you very much. I've got a question forming for you at the end of this last table clip.
So after much careful deliberation, the first one, we were smack bang in the middle because of we thought it had to be case specific, and you could be as flexible as you wanted, but that could increase risk and cost. So it depends on the situation. Second one, should growth contribute appropriately? We will all strongly agree. The third one, we had an arrow at strongly agree, and we had an arrow just a bit up from depends on the circumstance, which tells you where our thinking is. Maintain adaptability through change. We went to essential because that means if you need to pivot in the middle of a decision or a project that you've got because of unintended risks or consequences, you need to have that flexibility to be able to do that. Consider intergenerational fairness. We were there, absolutely essential. That's part of the reason the council's here is to, and we felt that the current consideration of our residents is completely intertwined with the intergenerational consideration. You can't separate them. They're both the one and the same. And then on the last one, avoid unnecessary complexity, we were kind of a bit up from complexity unavoidable because of the risk management. That's careful for us, careful governance in terms of risk.
Okay. Thank you all for contributing, building up my knowledge bank. It's been a pleasure for me. The question I'm asking myself in that intergenerational space is, because I've observed council does a 20-year long-term plan, which is now interesting to me. I had assumed that's because intergenerational considerations was at the heart of this table, but now I'm beginning to question how that's come about, because I feel like 20 years signals intergenerational, but when I listen to you talk, you're not really wed to it. So
I tried to change that last time, but was told that we couldn't.
good to know. Might be one of those policy settings.
Exactly. Yeah. I think because we're constrained by other influences in terms of why we couldn't bring it back to 10. Yeah. Yeah, it was a good debate about it.
Because we had the 30-year infrastructure strategy as well, and there was also, we found, well, some people around the table were concerned that councils took the view of putting things just outside year 10, so year 12, 11, 12, just kick it down the can down a little bit, and that wasn't helpful in the context of a growth picture that we were in, and really need to signal those kind of what was coming and some of the sequencing. So it was a good debate. Yeah.
We do it from year 4. It's not even year 11, it's year 4, because each term has a new long-term plan, and the other ones that are, it's not really long. That's why one of the reasons why I wanted to come back. But yeah.
It is one of those things that would be good to address, and I think the work that's being done at the moment around the 3 activity areas that you've requested us to look at for changes in the long-term plan, those things, therefore, we might be looking at doing something for those in the first 3 years, but we want to start to see it's not a 1 to 3 year plan, it is at least a 10-year, if not longer. And I think the conversation that I hear around the table around growth tells me that you do have that intergenerational thinking. So I feel like one of the next steps I need to do is put up some definitions, if you like, of what these things mean and what they don't mean, so that we're very clear around this table exactly what we mean when we talk about that thing. So I heard it come up when it's in there around appropriately being one of those words, and fairness and things like that. So there's perhaps some terms that we need to land on. This is how we define this thing when we talk about it. So thanks so much. I'm going to come around and collect those from you. What we're going to do next, so I'm going to go away and take the lovely pictures that you've drawn for me today and digest them and come back. So I will provide you with the outcomes of what you've provided them today, but again, I'm working on that wider pack so that it's just a knowledge bank, if you like, for any time you want to call on what did we talk about in that interest space or that depreciation space, etc., that it's there for you to refer to. I understand that during July workshops are pretty lean, and so in terms of the long-term plan timetable, it'll kick off in earnest again in August. That's not to say that staff aren't working hard behind the scenes to actually look at those activities and get ready so that when we have those discussions with you in August, we're ready to hit the ground running. Ngā mihi.
Thank you, Alison, for that summing up of the Rubik's Cube that is finance. Take 5 minutes, everyone, because we need to go publicly excluded for